Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with Jack Woods, who's one of our consultants here at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today, Jack and I are going to be talking about information risk assessment and risk treatment in ISO 27001. So Jack, my first question for you is, what is the purpose of a risk assessment?
Good question. It's the key question really, is what everyone wants to know. So there are a few steps to a risk assessment, and there are a few reasons why organisations will conduct a risk assessment. So the first part of that is identifying threats, hazards, risks, recognising those potential risks, whether they're kind of physical, financial, operational, reputational, those kind of things. And then from there, you want to evaluate the likelihood of and impact of those risks kind of occurring, and what the severity of that impact might be if that risk were to come into fruition. So those are the first kind of parts of the risk assessment and the purpose of it, to identify those key risks to the organisation and then those likelihoods and impacts of those occurring. And then from that, you can kind of take in those points, and you can then determine how you want to prioritise actioning those risks, if those risks require any action at all. There are various views on what the words should be when associating kind of risk action. So there's AART, so accept, avoid, reduce and transfer. It's ART is the acronym. So there are a few different kind of acronyms that are in use, but that's a common one that we see. And so it's good to get an understanding of which of those risks is posing the greatest threat to your organisation, and then which of those risks is quite low risk and it's not going to be a big issue. And that allows you to kind of then determine what mitigation you may take. And that leads into the kind of the next aspect of it. So the mitigation or the control of risks. So based on those assessments that you conduct, you can then identify strategies or measures or controls that will allow you to implement maybe technical controls or physical controls, implement some procedural controls, maybe identify that you want an acceptable use policy to reduce the likelihood of staff misusing their assets, for example. So once you've identified those risks and you've prioritized them, you can then kind of implement some of those controls, those mitigation actions. Some of the risk assessments that organizations conduct aren't necessarily always information security focused either. So there may be risk assessments that are required by law, so health and safety risk assessments, for example, environmental kind of protection risk assessments, those kind of aspects. But given that we're talking about ISO 27001, we're going to stick on the focus of information security focused risk assessment. And those risk assessments, like I say, it allows you to support strategic planning as well. Having a risk assessment allows you to plan for kind of future aspects, future outcomes and future goals as well. You may have objectives that you've got set as an organisation that actually you've only identified because you've conducted a risk assessment and you've decided, well, actually, yeah, that's a big risk. We're going to say that we want to reduce the number of incidents in a 12-month period by kind of 50%, and we're going to do that by introducing these controls that have been highlighted as part of our risk assessment. And finally, a risk assessment itself enhances how prepared you are as an organisation. If you're proactive about risk management, it can help you for kind of identify those risks, and it will help you prepare for unexpected situations. That's the key, really, the key purpose of what a risk assessment is for.
And how does risk fit into ISO 27001 specifically?
The standard itself is risk-based. The main focus, and from the mandatory clauses, we've got clause 6 and clause 8, and they mandate that organisations must perform risk assessments as part of establishing an information security management system, but they should also establish a defined process for conducting those risk assessments. And that's a key part. So clause 6 talks about establishing the processes for those risk assessments, and then clause 8 is actually following those processes, looking at those risk assessments, actually conducting those risk assessments in line with what you've set out as a requirement in clause 6. And the reason that the standard requires organizations to put these processes in place is so that when you're conducting risk assessments, you're provided with kind of consistent and comparable results over time. Because what you don't want is to conduct a risk assessment and then do another one maybe 6-12 months later, not have a process for it, and get a completely different outcome that isn't comparable to the risk assessment that you conducted the year before. So having that process in place really allows you to kind of get good, focused, comparable results. And it's really helpful to the organization. It's one of those things that also the use of a risk assessment, I think it's a clause 6.1.3 in terms of information security risk treatment, requires you to identify controls and produce a statement of applicability. So where you've identified some of the Annex A controls from ISO 27001, you would then need to produce a statement of applicability in terms of why you've chosen those controls from that set of controls, and also that the set that you kind of get given as part of ISO 27001 isn't an exhaustive list. So just because you've conducted a risk assessment in line with the requirements of ISO 27001 in terms of clause 6 and clause 8, you don't have to select any of the Annex A controls as part of that. If an organization wanted to choose a different control set, that's perfectly acceptable. They would just need to identify that in their statement of applicability and say, these are the controls that we're going to use. This is where they come from. This is why we've included them. Here's our justification. And it's the same if you weren't to include those controls in scope, you need to provide a justification as to why they're not in scope as well. The standard doesn't give you a specific methodology to follow. It's not prescriptive in that way. It's instructive in terms of this is what you need to do, but it doesn't tell you how you should go about doing it. So there are lots of ways that organizations conduct risk assessments. There's no specific correct answer, but the standard itself just wants you to be able to produce repeatable and kind of comparable results for risk assessments over time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jack. So you've said there that the standard itself doesn't tell you how to conduct a risk assessment, but in your experience, how would you go about conducting an ISO 27001 risk assessment? What sort of methods or tips or hints do you have for making sure that's effective?
Yeah, of course. So when conducting the kind of the ISO 27001 risk assessment, the first thing that you really should be doing is defining the scope of what's going to be included as that risk, as part of that risk assessment. So that's kind of identifying your assets, systems, processes within the organization that fall within the scope of the management system. So if you're doing an information security risk assessment, any assets that you've got that relate to the information security of the ISMS, you want to include as part of the scope for your management system. That should be your first step, identifying that scope, defining what's included and what's not. And kind of from there, you then use that predefined kind of your risk assessment methodology to conduct those risk assessments in line with the assets that you've identified. So there are criteria that the standard expects you to consider. So triggers for performing a risk assessment. So if there's an annual review, if there's a change in external or internal issues, if you've suffered an incident. There are areas that also need to be considered, like risk acceptance criteria. If you as an organization are happy to accept risks within a certain level of tolerance, then you can do that. You just need to have that acceptance criteria defined to say, we accept risks below the level of medium, for example. Organizations tend to use a 4-level risk approach. So they'll have low, medium, high, critical generally. And a lot of organizations also use a 5x5 matrix to identify likelihood and impact. So a 5 likelihood and a 5 impact would give you a 25, and that would be classed as your critical risk. But then maybe a 2 impact and a 3 likelihood is going to give you a 6, and actually maybe that's classed as a medium risk. And so it's just about defining where those acceptable levels are for you as an organization. And then once you've kind of got that all in place, you've got your risk scoring matrix, you've got your criteria for risk acceptance, you know where the kind of criteria for conducting a risk assessment have come from in terms of incident changes, annual reviews. You can then go on to identify those risks to information security by looking at those assets that you deemed as in scope and kind of determining the potential threats to those. You can sort of reverse engineer the controls from Annex A. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario where you need to do the risk assessment to determine which controls are applicable to you as an organization from Annex A, but you could also reverse engineer the controls from Annex A to say, well, actually, does that apply to this asset? And so that would be a really good way or really useful way of determining what kind of controls are going to be applicable to you, what threats you need to consider, and then conducting the risk assessment based on that, looking at the likelihood and impact, looking at maybe the inherent risk, and then what the residual risk would be after you've implemented the control from Annex A, for example. And once you've identified those risks, you'll be able to move into kind of the analysis, evaluation phase. You've got that matrix, you know the likelihood and impact, you've got the overall risk score, and then you can kind of determine what actions you're going to take, whether that's going to be to accept, to avoid, to reduce, or to transfer. Those likelihood scores should reflect the probability of the risk materializing, whereas the impact score should represent the potential consequence if that risk were to occur. And then those consequences may vary depending on the scope of your risk assessment. But they typically include kind of financial loss, reputational damage, and other organizational impacts.
Perfect. Thank you, Jack. So I think you started to touch on this a little bit in your previous answer, but if you could take a deeper dive into what actions organizations can take to treat these risks.
So yeah, like I mentioned, we kind of use the AART, the ART methodology in terms of treating risk. And so where a risk has fallen within tolerance, the organization may wish to kind of accept that level of risk as is. Some organizations, even though a risk is within tolerance, if that risk is quite easily fixable, they will put those remediation actions in place just because it's quick and easy and it reduces that risk even further. But some organizations are just happy to accept a risk that's within tolerance. There are, like I say, there are the other methods that you could choose. You could choose to avoid the risk altogether. The difficulty with that is you can't completely take away the likelihood or the impact of a risk taking place. So if you were to look at it as a triangle, if your assets at the top and your impact and likelihood are the two bottom kind of parts of that triangle, there's only one aspect of that triangle that you can take away to avoid risk completely, and that's the asset. That's avoiding doing that activity. So the only way really to avoid risk is to kind of discontinue that activity. But again, if that's going to impact your organization and kind of stop you from being able to work, then you aren't likely to take that approach. One of the other ways is transferring the risk to a third party. The most common is an insurer. So if there is a risk that, I don't know, you are going to be a victim of a cyber attack, for example, you may transfer part of that risk to a third party who either insure you against that, or provide you with technological security services that will protect you from that risk. And then finally, the kind of most common treatment option is that reduce action that we've talked about. So implementing controls, whether technical, procedural, whether they're from Annex A of the standard or from any other kind of standard out there. That's the most common approach to risk, and you can do that in various different ways. Once you've kind of selected the options, you know where you stand with the risks that you've identified and where reduce is chosen. Annex A provides a good list. There's 93 controls in there. It provides a good list and it covers quite a wide range of topics, such as kind of access control, physical security, people security or people control, incident management, etc. There's quite a lot of stuff in there. It's not exhaustive, but it's a very good start. And so once you've done all of that, really, you're going to be in a really good position to kind of document the results of those risk assessments, document the decisions that you've made, document what the treatment actions you've identified are, identify your risk treatment plan, whether you've accepted it, whether you've put actions in place to reduce that risk, and then go from there. The key thing is, though, the standard requires you to monitor, review, and regularly revisit those risk assessments. So I mentioned right at the start about having defined criteria and those triggers for risk assessment, whether that's incident, change in external and internal kind of requirements, and the annual review. So the standard, I think the wording in the standard is these risk assessments shall be regularly reviewed. Regularly is very grey. Most organisations do an annual review and have those ad hoc reviews when those other triggers occur.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Jack.
Cheers.
And for any of our listeners that want to learn a bit more about this topic, Jack's written a really insightful blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, and that's called Information Risk Assessment and Treatment in ISO 27001. So please go and check that out. And thank you for listening today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.